yeah, we're still doing the same idea. You say, this is my friend Etienne. He's going to tell you a little bit about the goals.
Yeah, things are a little bit faster and looser now, but yes.
That's what we like.
Yes. Let's just check our tuning while we can.
Sounds pretty good.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited that you can all tune in today to join us at the Praeludium Early Music Festival happening in St. John's. This is actually the first event of the festival. My name is Arlen Greens, and today I'll be guiding you through our program. Our show today is all about storytelling. Now, it might not be the kind of storytelling that you're expecting. I'm going to tell you a few small stories, but I'm going to be playing a little bit more music for you than I am telling stories. I'm going to talk about how classical music composers from long, long ago were able to use music to tell stories of their own, even when that music didn't involve words, so we can actually tell stories with music that isn't even sung. We're going to start out with a very, very exciting and interesting piece by a man named Telamon. Now, he wrote this about 300 years ago, which is a very, very long time ago. Back then, people were different, languages were different, and even instruments were different. But we'll talk about some of the instruments in a moment. Telamon was a big friend of a man named J.S. Bach, who you might have heard of. Maybe Bach is a little more famous than Telamon. So they kind of bounced ideas off of each other often, and they sometimes wrote some very similar stuff. Now, Telamon also really liked to read. And one of the books that Telamon read was a book that had just come out in this time, and it was a book called Gulliver's Travels. This book is still very famous today, too. You might have heard of it. And it tells the story of a man named Gulliver who gets in a boat and decides to explore the world. Along the way, he meets all kinds of interesting people. So Telamon wrote a piece for 2 violins, which tells the story of Gulliver's Travels. Now, to help me play this, I'm joined by my friend, and would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Etienne Pemberton. I'm going to play this duo with Arlen today. I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the equipment we're using to make music today. Both of us are violinists, and we play in the symphony here in St. John's. We just played a concert last night. And the equipment we use is quite different than what they would have used 300 years ago to play this music. And getting to play this music with the right tools is really fun for me. It's not something I get to do a lot. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit, for instance, about the bow I'm using today. This bow is much shorter than a modern bow. It's also curved the other way. Any of you who've seen a fiddle or a violin bow would have seen that the curve usually goes this way. Well, this one goes that way. The tension is much lower, which makes it lighter, and you can sink into the string more. It's actually quite a fun experience to play this way. It's not as loud, but it's very pleasant to play, and I think it's very pleasant to hear as well. One more note I'd like to say is, you know, now Arlen and I have our modern violins, and they're great, and we're going to use them for the rest of our lives. Back then, especially with bows, it was almost like we would be with iPhones or computers now. There was always the latest technology, and musicians in an orchestra might be using different types of bows, little different lengths, different ways of holding the frog on. They would talk about what the latest from this bow maker was or that bow maker, and when they were done with them, they were just often just chuck them out like we would chuck out an iPhone 4 that's not fast enough anymore.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to get started playing for you. Now, just like Gulliver's Travels, this piece is in chapters, which sometimes we call movements when we're talking about music. But chapters equals movements. Now, for the first one, Gulliver is just setting off on his adventures. Not a lot has happened yet, but he's pretty excited. So we're going to play this very exciting opening music as Gulliver gets ready to leave. So Gulliver is on his way. He's in his boat, and he's going out into the world. The first island that he gets to is filled with very, very tiny people. They're just a few inches tall. So to them, Gulliver seems like a giant. And they think, whoa, we can really use a giant around here. So they're asking him, can you build buildings for us? Can you go fight wars for us? And so he doesn't stay very long because he doesn't like having to do all these things for them. But this is a little dance that's supposed to be written by those little tiny people. Telamon did something very clever here, which actually you don't hear when you listen. But the performers have their music written in these ridiculously tiny little notes, just like little tiny people wrote down this music. And you'll also see when we play it for you, there's a couple other things about it that make you think of small. So it's a very small piece written by very small people. So Gulliver gets back in his boat. And funnily enough, the next island he comes to is filled with giants. So now he's the little guy. Telamon does the same kind of joke here that he did with the other one. Now our music is written in giant notes, as if written by really big people. So this is a jig for two giants. As you can imagine, giants are a little clumsy when it comes to doing jigs. So he has a good time watching these giants dance a jig. And then he goes on. He keeps going. Now, the next place that Gulliver gets to is pretty strange. It's full of really, really smart people. Very smart people. And they spend all day thinking about very smart topics like math and science and music. Now, sometimes they're just thinking so hard about these things that they can't actually talk to their friends. Because they get to talking, but then they start thinking about science or music, and they sort of trail off. So it's really hard to get anything done in this place, because everybody just keeps thinking instead of doing anything. But they have a solution. So the people that live here, well, they have their friends with them all the time. And their friends have a feather. And so when they notice that somebody starts drifting off, their friends come in with the feather and tickle them and wake them up. And then that's how they get things done, is they have to keep being woken up. I think you'll hear that. And then Gulliver goes to one last place on his journey. Now, this is another really strange place. The people that live there are probably what we would call horses. Well, they are horses, but they're very, very smart horses. So they live in houses and they go to school and they talk to each other. They even have a name for themselves, which humans can't really pronounce, but it's something like Houyhnhnms. Now, in this place, there's these really smart horses. There's also humans, but the humans here are like wild animals. They're not smart. They don't live in houses or go to school. And they're called yahoos. Very wild, uncivilized people. So, they both live on this island together. So, Telamon has written their two dances that they would do. One which is very civilized, and one which is very wild. But here's the catch. We're going to do them at the same time. that concludes Gulliver's Travels. Thank you very much, Etienne.
Thank you, Arlen.
So we're going to go back in time a little bit. Also, I'm going to go off on screen for a little bit because I'm switching to a little bit different instrument. Here, you can take this. I have this. Okay, so we're going back in time a little bit. Pardon me while I do a little bit of setup here. We're going back to a piece written about 350 years ago by a man named Bieber. Now, this isn't the Bieber that you've heard on the radio. Unless you're listening to classical music on the radio. Maybe you then have. Now, Bieber was a phenomenal violinist in his day. Probably the best violinist alive back then. He invented a lot of the ways that we still play violin today. Now, before we get to playing this, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the violin that Bieber knew and the violin that I'm playing today. And we talked a little bit already about the bow, but the instrument itself is a little different from what you would find, say, in a symphony orchestra today. We still have 4 strings. It's still, I think it still looks like a violin. The biggest difference is what those strings are made of. They're actually made out of something called gut. Now, that's gut as in guts. So it's from the inside of a cow or a sheep, and they treat them a very certain way, and then they make strings out of that. Now, it's not as gross as it sounds. They're actually, you can't even tell. It kind of looks like plastic. And the reason why anybody would ever do such a thing is because it sounds really good. It makes really excellent strings. So this is the kind of instrument that Bieber would have been playing on, was something with gut strings. Now, gut strings let you do something really cool that you can't do as well on modern violins, which is you can mess with the tuning in all kinds of creative ways. So that's actually what he's done. Instead of having my highest string, where it normally is, he's actually asked me to, well, the music asked me, he didn't call me up. But the music asked me to tune that highest string down a little bit. The reason for that is this is pretty sad music. But first, I'd like to just introduce you to the people playing with me.
My name's Nathan Cook. I run the chamber music program here at Memorial, and I play the cello. And since you were talking about strings, I should point out, and the differences, I should point out that I'm playing on a completely modern instrument. But I'm going to be doing some things that are going to hopefully mimic, and this is what a lot of modern players do, hopefully try to mimic the kind of sound that Arlen's going to be able to get with his period bow and his gut strings. So you'll see me, I'm going to be holding my modern bow, which curves this way, like Etienne was talking about. I'm going to be holding it a little further away from what we call the frog than I normally do, which makes the bow feel a little lighter, and it makes it work a little bit more like a period bow, I can pretend. The other thing that you might be able to see is I've got this little, what we call an end pin on the end of the cello. That wouldn't have been there on a Baroque instrument. That was a later development, and people would have held the instrument more like this, just with their legs. I'm not going to do that because I'm not used to doing that, and it can cause problems for people who aren't used to doing that. So I'm just going to stick the end pin back out and onto the ground so that the ground can help me fight the forces of gravity, so to speak. So, there you go.
I'm Mary O'Keefe. I am Canada's easterly-most professional harpsichordist. This is a harpsichord. They come in various sizes, shapes, sometimes 1 keyboard, sometimes 2, and sometimes weirdly even more than that. It looks like a little piano, but the mechanism is different. The strings are plucked instead of hit, and that creates a completely different sound and actually a different technique for playing. And so it also gives a very bright, clear sound, which makes it blend extremely well with other instruments. The harpsichord was invented well before the piano, hundreds of years before the piano, and this was the instrument that was used in just about all music, except church music maybe, but it was used to accompany all kinds of music, chamber music, orchestral music, operas, arias, recitals, all that kind of thing. And also there's a vast repertoire of solo music for this beautiful instrument.
Thank you. So together, cello and harpsichord make up what's called the continuo team. And basically they help a soloist, which is me, sound even better when we play. Now, Bieber wrote a lot of music for this combination. Back in his day, the #1 organization that was asking for music to be written was the Catholic Church. So there's actually a lot of Christian music from back then. This is an example of that. This is actually something very dramatic. This is called The Crucifixion. And it's supposed to be a piece full of pain and suffering to really bring out the tragedy of that story. But also, Bieber was a fantastic violinist, and sometimes he wrote things just to show off. So we're going to start this for you, and then we'll talk a little bit more through it. So that little chapter, or movement, was called the Praeludium. And that's sort of a little taste of what's to come in the piece. It gets people's attention, it sets the mood, and it's kind of like a little attention getter, like a trailer for a movie. Now, in the next chapter, it's a little bit longer, Bieber does what every good storyteller does. He does something called embellishing. So if I was telling a story about, let's say I found a spider in my room, and I wanted to embellish that story, if I wanted to make it more interesting, I might say, well, there was the biggest spider ever in my room, and I barely made it out alive. Now that's maybe not true. It was maybe just, a spider on the wall. It was okay. But it sure makes the story a lot more interesting. So Bieber was really good at doing sort of the musical equivalent of that, at musical embellishment. So he would take a very simple theme, simple song, that's maybe not the most interesting thing in the world, and he'd play it for you once, and you'd go, yeah, that's pretty nice. And then he'd get fancy. Then he'd add things and make things up and do a whole lot of embellishing to make that story more interesting. So you're going to hear first a simple theme called an aria, and then you're going to hear 5 different variations or embellishments on that same theme. Now, one other quick note before we get there. You remember I talked about these strings being made of gut? Well, maybe you're wondering why we don't use them very much anymore today. It's because they go out of tune really, really easily. So we're actually just going to pause very quickly here and tune and make sure that we're all still lined up, and then we'll go right into the aria.
Strings, however.
Thank you. So Bieber was a big fan of playing very fast, as you may have noticed. We're going to step back a little bit further in time now. We were just about 350 years ago, and we're going to rewind to over 400 years ago. Now, if times were different 300 or 350 years ago, they were really different back over 400. Instruments were a lot different. The type of music we listened to was a lot different. I mean, people were even just starting to explore the world. Newfoundland didn't even have anybody from Europe that was living here yet. It was just the indigenous people still. Now, we're also going to switch gears to instruments that are completely different. We're going to be playing instruments called viols, or violas da gamba. At first, you're probably going to think we're bringing out a bunch of cellos, but we're not. These are viols. And we're going to talk our way through them here for you. Thank you very much. So, as you can tell, they come in a variety of sizes and even a couple different shapes. Why don't we go around and introduce ourselves and the instrument that we are holding.
Okay. I'm Christina Smith, and this is a bass viol, and it's quite ornate. You can see it's got a nice carved head on top and purfling on the back and fancy designs on it, and it plays the low-sounding part of the consort.
And I'm holding something called the tenor viola da gamba, which is kind of the middle voice of the quartet.
And I'm Jane Design, and I'm holding a treble viola da gamba, which is the highest instrument in the consort.
I'm Maggie Britton, and I'm also holding the treble viol.
So we're going to go ahead and play for you before we talk a little bit more. This is a very short little number. It's written by an Englishman named Thomas Morley, and its title is April is in My Mistress's Face. So, now maybe you're wondering why this song had such an interesting title. April is in my mistress's face. Well, that sounds a lot like words to a song or a poem. And in fact, what we just played for you and what we're about to play for you are actually taken from songs. Now, it's a special kind of song that was very popular back then, sort of sung by a small choir of 3 or 4 people. And it would have lyrics, just like a song you would be familiar with today. and they happened to be really excellent music. So players of viols, these here instruments, thought, well, I'd kind of like to play that. So that actually was a thing that happened fairly often, is viol concerts would actually play these pieces that were originally sung. Now obviously we can't make outright words with our instruments, but some of the ways that we will attack things, so in other words, how we will start or end notes on these instruments, can bring out the way that some of the words sounded. Maggie, I wonder if you could pass me, there's some paper behind you with some lyrics to this song. Yes, I think that's it. Thank you. So I'd like to read the lyrics for you before we play so that you can kind of listen for them. This next one is another one by Thomas Morley, and it's called Blow, Shepherds, Blow. And here are the lyrics. Blow, shepherds, blow. Blow your pipes with glee resounding, with gladsome glee resounding. See lo, where the fair Eliza, see she comes with love, love and heavenly grace abounding. Run nymphs apace, go meet her with flowers and garlands goodly greet her. All hail Eliza fair, the country's goddess. Long mayst thou live, the shepherd's queen and lovely mistress. Now, there's a lot of words in there that we kind of don't use anymore, but the idea is that it's actually celebrating the queen. This is Queen Elizabeth I. And so when he mentions all hail Eliza, well, Eliza is Elizabeth. And this is basically a little song celebrating the reign of the queen. And sometimes so when it's introduced in the song, it goes, all hail Eliza fair. And it's kind of supposed to sound like like trumpets doing a fanfare as she enters the room. Now, when Morley uses words like shepherds and nymphs, he's also kind of working with the storytelling that was happening in his time. So people at the time would have been very familiar with Greek and Roman stories, and these would often involve nymphs or shepherds. So he was kind of referring to stock characters, or people that listeners would be familiar with. So the modern equivalent might be making a Harry Potter reference. So we're going to go ahead and play this now for you, Blow, Shepherds, Blow, and try to hear some of the sounds and moods of the words that I just read. Excellent. Thank you, friends. So that concludes our show on Baroque storytelling today. I hope that you've had an interesting time hearing some of the sounds and stories of the Baroque period. And next time you're listening to any classical music, see if you can hear if there's a story going on, even if there aren't any words. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of my friends who have joined me on stage today, as well as Memorial University, the Newfoundland and Labrador Arts Council, and the Newfoundland and Labrador Center for Distance Learning and Innovation, all of which who have made this school show and festival possible. Thank you very much, and bye for now.